I wasn't looking for secrets that day. All I wanted was my great-grandmother's birth certificate. But in the basement of the old St. Landry courthouse, under dust so thick it looked like ash, I found a metal trunk with my family name carved into the lid. It was sealed shut with rusted chains, and a wooden tag that read, "Do not open. Ever." Of course I opened it. Inside were papers wrapped in rotting cloth. Ledgers. Hand-drawn maps. Medical notes. Letters written by women whose names no one in my family had ever spoken aloud. And then I saw it. A page with handwriting that matched my great-grandmother's. 3 words at the top. We were below. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear was buried for over 100 years, and some families still want it buried now. I thought I knew where I came from. I thought my ancestors were farmers, laborers, simple people. I was wrong. There was a basement beneath the plantation, and the women taken down there, they were never meant to be found. I grew up hearing stories about St. Landry Parish, stories about river floods, cotton fields, and family reunions that always seemed to leave out the years before 1900. No one in my family ever told stories from the 1800s. That silence didn't bother me when I was young. But when I got older, polite silence started to feel a lot like hiding. In Louisiana, people love history. They love telling it, arguing about it, exaggerating it. But there was one plantation, one patch of land on the edge of Opelousas, that no one mentioned. Not even once. I first noticed it during a genealogy project in college. Every plantation around it had documents, tax records, ledgers, family trees, census files. But this single property simply appeared in 1830 and vanished from official history after 1865, as if swallowed by the earth. A blank space on every map. A missing chapter in every book. A silence too perfect to be accidental. The locals had a name for it. Belle Noire. The Black Beauty. Or, as one old man told me at a gas station, "Don't ask about that place, Cher. Ain't nothing there but ghosts." I laughed then. I don't laugh now. My investigation started with something small. Birth records. I had been searching for my great-grandmother Marie's birthplace. Family stories said she was born on a farm outside Opelousas, but every document I found contradicted the last. One record said private property. Another said no official residence. A third simply said restricted. Restricted? For a birth record from 1838? That made no sense. The deeper I searched, the stranger it got. Entire ledgers from the parish courthouse were missing between 1830 and 1849. Some pages were torn out. Some books had been rebound with whole sections removed. Some entries had ink spilled across names, deliberate spills too thick to be accidents. Something had been erased. Not by time. By someone. So I went to the oldest source I could think of, the elderly. I spent weeks speaking to people in their 80s and 90s in Opelousas, Eunice, and Sunset. Most refused to talk as soon as I mentioned Belle Noire. Others simply shook their heads. One woman in a nursing home whispered, "Baby, we don't speak of that place. Not even to God." Another told me, "If you dig up that story, you won't sleep." But there was one man, a retired schoolteacher, who gave me something real. He leaned in close and lowered his voice. There was a house on that land. Big one. White columns. Pretty as a picture. But that ain't what people feared. It was what was under it. They say they kept women down there. Hundreds over the years. Took him down, brought him up, changed. Changed how? I asked. He shook his head. No one ever saw. They only heard. And by the time they burned the place, everybody knew something evil had been happening. Burnt. The house had burned. But by who? And why? He didn't know. Or maybe he did and didn't want to say. But his last sentence stayed with me. If you really want to know the truth, check the courthouse basement. They hid things down there when the war ended. He gave me directions as if giving me coordinates to a grave. And that's how, days later, I ended up in the courthouse basement holding a flashlight, brushing dust off locked cabinets, and searching for any trace of Belle Noire. The basement felt colder than it should have, like the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather but from memory. There were rows of cabinets, shelves stacked with boxes from the 1800s, and corners so dark the shadows looked alive. Most boxes were labeled. But one section, a whole wall, had labels scraped off. Deep scratches. As if someone didn't just remove the labels. They wanted no one to ever read what was there. And then I saw it. Behind a fallen beam and a stack of broken furniture, a corner of metal peeking out from under cloth. A trunk. Ironbound. Padlocked but rusted through. I dragged it into the light. The metal screeched against the floor, a sound sharp enough to echo off the concrete. On the lid, buried under dust and grime, was one word: DeVoe. My family name. My heart dropped. My surname wasn't rare, but it wasn't common either. There was no good reason it should have been stamped on a trunk in a courthouse basement from the 1800s. I brushed away more dust. Underneath the name was a phrase carved by hand, deep into the metal. House records, lower level. Lower level? Then in smaller writing. Private use. Do not release. Every instinct in my body told me to walk away, to close the trunk, to leave it buried like everyone else had. But curiosity is its own kind of curse. I found a loose hinge, pried it with a crowbar, and the lid opened with a groan that sounded almost alive. Inside were bundles of paper tied with red twine. Some ink had faded. Some pages were torn. But every sheet carried the same smell: mildew, earth, and something older. Something like grief. At the top was a date, 1837. And under it, a sentence written in a woman's hand. What they did to us below was not meant to be remembered. 1837 Louisiana. One plantation. One erased truth finally uncovered. Would you keep reading, or would you have closed the trunk? When I lifted the first bundle of papers from the trunk, the red twine snapped like a brittle bone. Pages slid across the floor. Ink dust rose into the air. And the smell, earthy, metallic, almost like dried blood, wrapped around me. These pages hadn't seen light in over a century. The first sheet was a ledger. Neat columns. Dates, ages, measurements, and names. So many names. Some wrote in full. Some abbreviated. Some only initials. But row after row had one word stamped beside them. Transferred, LL. Lower level. I didn't understand what LL meant yet, but something in my stomach tightened. Then I saw it. A name I recognized. Marie D. 1838. Age, 19. Condition, healthy. Notes, literate. Calm temperament. Status, moved to LL. My hands began shaking. Marie. My great-grandmother. The woman whose recipes we still cook at family gatherings. The woman my grandfather described as quiet but strong. The woman whose picture hung in my uncle's hallway, smiling in a faded dress with lace she had sewn herself. Here she was. Not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a human, but as an entry, a statistic, a line item. Her name wasn't crossed out on this page. Not yet. But when I flipped the sheet over, another entry showed her name again. And this time, someone had crossed it out so violently the ink cut deep grooves into the paper. Not a polite line. Not a careful strike. A slash born of anger. Or fear. Or both. Below the crossed-out name, someone had written a single phrase. She knows too much. My breath caught. I sat on the cold basement floor and reread that phrase until my vision blurred. How did she know too much? What was she forced to witness? And why did someone try to wipe her name away? I kept turning pages. More names. More notations. Some marked with LL. Others marked with sold. Some marked with a circle, which I later learned meant unfit. Some marked with a star, which meant promising. Human beings graded like livestock. Then I reached a page unlike the others. It wasn't neat. It wasn't organized. It was chaotic, as if someone had written it in a panic. The ink was smudged. The letters slanted and uneven. And across the top was a sentence that made my heart slam against my ribs. If anyone finds this, tell my daughter I remembered her. No signature. Only initials, MD. Marie. My great-grandmother. This wasn't a ledger entry. This was a message. A plea. A crack in the silence forced on her. I read it again, whispering the words into the empty courthouse basement. Tell my daughter I remembered her. Remembered her? Why wouldn't she? The question lodged in my throat. I turned the page. And that's when I realized what this ledger really was. It wasn't a record of work. Not a record of punishment. Not even a record of births. It was a breeding ledger. A document tracking enslaved women selected, monitored, rotated, evaluated, and paired, for a purpose I hadn't fully understood yet. Every LL marked a woman moved to the basement level. Every paired entry linked two names together. Every successful or failed note referenced conception. My great-grandmother wasn't just an enslaved woman. She was part of a system designed in darkness, refined with cruelty, carried out underground, literally. My hands went cold. I turned another page. On the left column, names of enslaved women. On the right, names of enslaved men. Between them, arrows, dates, Results. Pairings. Forced ones. Not marriages. Not unions. Not choices. Assignments. My great-grandmother's name appeared 3 times. Each time paired with a different man. Each time with notes. Good temperament. Strong stock. Likely to produce skilled child. Skilled child? Skilled for what? I didn't want to keep reading. But I couldn't stop. The next sheet held something else. Something colder. A medical chart. Measurements. Pelvic notes. Blood pressure readings. Diet instructions. A line at the bottom read, "Move her to LL until delivery." And under it, in smaller handwriting, "She asks questions. Monitor her." That was the moment the basement grew colder around me, because I realized my great-grandmother didn't simply survive a plantation. She survived what was done beneath it. A place where paper replaced human memory, where pen strokes replaced names, where the truth was buried 1 floor deeper than anyone dared to acknowledge. I placed the documents on my lap and looked again at the crossed-out name, the violent slash through Marie D. Who crossed her out? What? And what did she see? The more I read, the more I noticed something strange. Names vanished after certain dates. Women disappeared from records. Pages were torn out, cleanly, deliberately. Entire months missing. Someone had tried to hide something very specific. Not all slavery. Not all labor. Not all punishment. Just the basement. Only the basement. Whatever happened down there. Even other enslavers didn't want written down. And yet, right here in my trembling hands, were the pages that escaped the fire. The truth they tried to erase. Anne-Marie's message. Tell my daughter I remembered her. I swallowed hard. If she remembered her daughter, then that meant someone took her daughter from her. The pain in those 5 words felt like a scream trapped under paper. And it wasn't the last scream I found. One name crossed out. One woman erased. One clue that opens the basement door. If you found your great-grandmother's name in a ledger like this, would you keep reading? The next bundle of papers felt different the moment I touched it. The edges weren't straight. The pages were thinner, more fragile, like someone had written them in secret, folded them small, and hidden them somewhere dry and dark. When I untied the twine, a letter fell out first. Yellowed, crumpled, barely holding together. The handwriting was jagged and shaky, but still legible. And at the top, written in faded ink, was a sentence that made every hair on my arm stand up. My name is Elin. I am telling what cannot stay buried. This was it. The first testimony. Not a ledger. Not a medical chart. Not the master's notes. A woman's voice. A voice they tried to silence. I took a slow breath and read. I remember the steps. I remember the cold. I remember the rings in the wall. And I remember the doctor. My throat tightened. Elin continued. We were taken at dusk so no one would see. Down the stones, one by one, holding the rope so we did not fall. The air changed first, cool like a well, then bitter like metal. Then we reached the door. A door? Under a plantation? The letter gave no measurements, no architectural details. Just fear woven into every line. When they opened it, the room breathed. Like it had lungs. Like it knew we were coming. I closed my eyes and tried to picture it. My great-grandmother, Elin, and the others descending into darkness while the world above continued without knowing. Or maybe knowing. And pretending not to. I read on. There was a table. Wood, but not like a kitchen table. It had straps. I did not understand at first. But Helen did. She cried before they even touched her. The image hit me hard. I imagined a small room lit by lanterns that cast long shadows, making the walls seem closer than they were. I imagined women standing barefoot on cold stone floors, the silence thick enough to feel. And I imagined the sound. Chains, metal rings scraping, the doctor's footsteps echoing too calmly for a place like that. Elin's testimony continued. They wrote everything. Every breath, every sound. We were not people to them. We were entries. They measured us like things. Measured. Just like I saw in the ledger. Her words aligned too perfectly with the documents to be coincidence. She described a man she called the doctor with blue hands, because ink had stained his fingers permanently. She described a master who smiled only when writing. She described another woman whose name she couldn't remember, but whose scream she would know again in death. And then she wrote something that stopped me cold. Marie tried to help me. She whispered to me in French and told me something I hold in my heart. She said, hold on to yourself no matter what they take. Marie, my great-grandmother. This was the first time I saw her mentioned by someone who knew her. Not as a line in a ledger. Not as a notation. but as a person. A young woman trying to help others survive the unimaginable. I kept reading. I saw the drawings. I saw the charts. They were deciding children before children even existed. The basement wasn't random cruelty. It was designed, planned, refined. Elin described rooms with shelves filled with bottles, notebooks, and tools she didn't understand. She described how women were rotated, examined, tracked. But the sentence that chilled me the most was this one. Under their feet was the land. Under our feet was the truth. She ended her letter with a plea. If you find this, tell our daughters. We remembered them. We thought of them even when we were below. We never stopped being their mothers. I set the letter down. The basement seemed quieter, as if absorbing her words, as if remembering. Then I reached a second page. A testimony recorded decades later in 1897 by a northern historian who had been interviewing elderly formerly enslaved people. At the top of the page, testimony of Elin Marshall, age 72. Location, Opelousas, Louisiana. Year, 1897. I read the interviewer's first question. What do you recall most clearly? And I read her answer. The silence. Not the screaming. The silence between the screams. It meant someone new had been brought down. Her words painted the basement in sound. Not noise. Not chaos. But intervals of dread. Moments when everyone held their breath, knowing another woman was being escorted down the stairs. Another name destined to disappear in ink. She described how days blended into nights because light never reached them. She described how the women bonded through whispers. Prayers, memories, songs hummed so softly they sounded like breathing. And she described the same thing my great-grandmother wrote. We remembered our children, even the ones we were not allowed to raise. At the bottom of the testimony, the historian added a note. Subject's eyes turned away when describing the lower place. Voice trembled, refused to enter details. Even after 60 years, the memory was too powerful to speak, too painful to put into words, too heavy to relive. I placed both documents side by side, the 1830s letter and the 1897 testimony. 2 moments in one woman's life, a lifetime apart, matching perfectly. These weren't just pages. This was truth, raw truth, buried truth. Truth that my family, and many families, had been taught never to touch. And yet, here it was, in my hands, waiting to be read. One testimony, one voice from the underground, one step closer to the truth. Would you have read her letter all the way through, or stopped halfway? The next stack of documents in the trunk didn't look like letters or ledgers. They were rolled tightly, tubes of paper sealed with brittle red wax. Architectural drawings, maps. The moment I unrolled the first one, dust lifted into the air like ash shaken from a burned house. The paper cracked along the edges. The ink, black, thick, angry, stayed sharp despite the decades. But what chilled me wasn't the age. It was the shape. The blueprint showed a rectangular structure beneath ground level. Not a root cellar. Not a storage room. No, this was larger. Much larger. Across the top, written in elegant 19th century script. Subterranean facility, Belle Noire Plantation. Subterranean facility. Not basement. Not cellar. Facility. That word doesn't belong on a plantation blueprint. My pulse quickened as I traced the layout with my finger. There were 6 rooms, all connected by a single narrow corridor. Examination room A. Examination room B. Holding room. Nursery. Records chamber. Preparation room. Under each label were notes in smaller handwriting. Reinforced. Ventilation essential. Keep temperatures low. Maintain privacy from upper levels. But the most disturbing note was this. Iron rings installed 5 feet apart. Limestone drilled accordingly. Iron rings. Just like Elin wrote in her testimony. Just like she remembered. 60 years later. With trembling hands. With haunted eyes. This blueprint wasn't a rumor. It wasn't an exaggeration from a survivor's trauma. It was engineered. Designed. Measured. Planned like a warehouse. Except it wasn't built for goods. It was built for women. I stared at the drawing again. The holding room was long, narrow. A rectangle with 7 dots along each wall. Each dot labeled ring. A hallway connected the holding room to 2 smaller chambers marked EX. Examination. The corridors had arrows. Instructions for how people should move through the space. This was a flow chart. A system. A conveyor belt for human beings. My stomach twisted. I tried to imagine my great-grandmother walking through those corridors, bare feet on cold stone, lantern light flickering on brick walls. The air heavy and stale because no fresh wind reached that deep underground. I imagined her standing in one of those exam rooms, surrounded by tools she didn't understand, facing the doctor with ink-stained hands. I imagined her clinging to anything that reminded her she was human. A word, a song, a memory. The truth hit me in a way the ledgers hadn't. Belle Noire wasn't hiding a secret room. It was hiding a secret world. A world designed for one purpose: to control bodies, to control births, to control future generations. Not a rumor, not a guess. A blueprint, drafted in ink, stamped, proved. The next rolled sheet revealed a cross-section view. A slice of earth showing the main plantation house above, and beneath it, the underground complex like a tumor growing under the soil. There were 3 entrances: main house cellar door, hidden garden entrance, masked by shrubs, servant's stairwell, locked from the outside. 3 ways in, but only one way out. The stairs leading back into the master's house. The note said, ensure compliance. Keep movement controlled. No access to exterior exits. No access. No escape. They had literally designed the place to keep women in and keep the world out. I kept reading, flipping from blueprint to blueprint. Then I found the page that stopped my breath. At the bottom of one drawing, circled in red ink, drain system installed for sanitation. But beneath it, scribbled later, in handwriting darker, heavier, more frantic, flush thoroughly after each procedure. No traces. Traces of what? I didn't want to guess. One blueprint showed small ventilation shafts rising through the earth to the kitchen building above. Thin pipes, barely wide enough to push a fist through. A note beside one shaft read, ventilation required to prevent illness. Maintain airflow for pregnancies. Pregnancies. There it was. The word they never said aloud in stories. The word they hid behind polite phrases like women's work. Belle Noire wasn't just a plantation. It was a breeding complex, a factory of human lives. And my great-grandmother was recorded inside that system. Measured, tracked, paired, monitored. But the roof above her was not sky, not trees, not clouds. It was the floorboards of a master's home. People were eating dinner, sleeping in warm beds, laughing, hosting guests, all while beneath them, under their feet, women were held underground, like seeds forced to sprout in darkness. As I stared at the blueprints, another thought took hold. Someone drew these. Someone ordered these rooms. Someone paid for this construction. Someone supervised every brick. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't improvisation. It wasn't a bad overseer or isolated cruelty. It was purpose-built architecture, designed for exploitation, optimized for efficiency, a system, engineered, refined, perfected, and erased. The last drawing showed something small at the bottom corner, a tiny door labeled Records Vault. My heart pounded. That was where the ledgers came from. The charts, the documents, the testimonies hidden inside the trunk. They had tried to erase the basement by burning the vault, but some pages survived. Pages carried by the women. Pages smuggled into mattresses. Pages left in trunks. Pages sealed by clerks who recognized horror when they saw it. I placed the blueprints flat on the concrete floor. The outlines of the rooms formed a shape that looked almost like a body, a skeleton under the land. Maybe that's what the old man meant when he said, "Ain't nothing there but ghosts." He was right. The basement was gone, but its bones remained in ink. Blueprints don't lie. This wasn't punishment, this was design. A system made underground. If you found blueprints like these, would you call it history or evidence? If the blueprints revealed the bones of the basement, the doctor's notes revealed its heartbeat. Cold, precise, mechanical. A mind that saw human beings not as souls, not even as workers, but as experiments. The doctor's papers were the thickest bundle in the trunk. 20 or 30 sheets tied so tight the twine had cut grooves into the edges. When I loosened it, the pages fanned out across the floor like fallen leaves, yellowed but terrifyingly intact. At the top of the first page, Dr. H. Prudhomme, Medical Observations, lower level. Medical Observations. My skin crawled. The first entry read, Subject, F17, H, 19. Condition, strong pelvic structure. Note, ideal candidate for Program A. Program A? I didn't want to know what Program A was. But the notes continued. Each subject had no name, just a number and a letter. F for female, M for male, C for child. Humanity erased in a single letter. Under each one were measurements. Hip width, shoulder span, pulse, emotional response, teeth condition, milk production after birth, milk production. I stopped there. Women weren't just workers or mothers. They were being treated like livestock, like a herd, like a breeding stable. My chest felt tight. I kept reading. One page had a rough sketch of a pelvis drawn in dark ink. Arrows pointed to areas labeled optimal spacing, delivery complications unlikely, strong genetic potential. Another note read, increased diet by 200 calories, protein recommended. It looked like a nutrition plan, but not one meant for health, one meant for results. Then I found a page written in red ink. F19 resistant today, crying during examination, remains unwilling, recommend restraint. Restraint. That word tasted like iron in my mouth. I flipped the page. The next entry was worse. Despite resistance, procedure completed. No injuries affecting fertility. Will monitor for conception. Procedure completed. No injuries affecting fertility. Every line was more violent for what it didn't say aloud. My great-grandmother, Elin Claudette. All the women in those testimonies, they weren't imagining their trauma. This document confirmed every fear they lived through. I moved to the next sheet. This one listed pairings. Pair F17 with M4. Repeat monthly until pregnancy confirmed. Under it, pair F21 with M9. Rotate partners if conception delayed. Rotate partners. Like tools. Like chess pieces. The coldness punched me in the throat. This wasn't cruelty born from rage, or sudden violence, or some twisted individual obsession. This was planned, scheduled, optimized, a system. The doctor wrote the next line like a shop foreman. Pregnancies falling behind projected schedule. Increase efficiency. Increase efficiency. Women weren't just enslaved. Their bodies were a timeline, a quota, a production goal. The next series of notes documented births. Delivery number 12. Healthy infant. Good lung capacity. Strong cry. Delivery number 13. Female, light complexion. High market value. And then a line that made me sit back against the wall. Delivery number 14. Mother cried excessively after infant removed. Monitor for emotional instability. Emotional instability. A mother crying for her stolen child. They called that instability. Under the doctor's handwriting, someone, maybe the master, had added, if instability persists, transfer out of program. Transfer out. I didn't need a dictionary to know what that meant. Women who cried too much or asked too many questions. They were sold away, punished, silenced, removed from the ledger like they never existed. Then I found the page that tied everything together. At the top, in heavy bold handwriting, economic assessment, lower level program. A medical file shouldn't contain an economic assessment, but this one did. The doctor wrote, the cost of maintaining one female subject is far less than purchasing new labor at market. Followed by, a productive female can generate 8 to 10 offspring in peak years. Then, projected profit per child, $600 to $1,200 by age 10 depending on complexion, strength, and skill. Projected profit. They calculated children like cotton bales, like they were inventory. Then the doctor wrote the line that made my stomach turn. The basement is more profitable than the fields. More profitable than the fields. Slavery was already the cruelest system imaginable. And even within that system, the basement was worse. Because it wasn't about labor. It was about manufacturing human beings. Children born into bondage with their futures pre-written in ink. The deeper I went into the papers, the colder the words became. F22 failed to conceive. Reassign her to field work. F14 weekends after childbirth. Consider replacing. Replace. As if she were a broken tool. Then I found a note written lightly, almost as if the doctor didn't want the master to read it. Some subjects show signs of despair. They speak of missing their children. This may impact future performance. Performance. That word felt like a slap. Women mourning their stolen babies. That grief was seen as a performance issue. The doctor's solution? At the bottom of the page. Recommend limited contact with infants. Prevents unhealthy emotional bonds. Unhealthy emotional bonds. A mother loving her child. They were dismantling humanity on purpose. Tearing apart mothers and babies to keep the system running smoothly. And my great-grandmother had lived through this. Not in a storybook. Not in a rumor. In reality. In flesh. In darkness. Her name was crossed out because she knew too much. because she saw too much, because she remembered. I gathered the doctor's papers into my lap. My fingers trembled as I held them. These weren't medical notes. They weren't scientific studies. They were evidence. Evidence of a system designed underground, operated in secret, erased from history. Evidence of what they did. Evidence of what she survived. Ink-stained hands. Cold notes. Lives reduced to data. The basement wasn't madness. It was method. If you read these notes about your ancestor, would you feel anger or would you feel grief? There was a moment, sitting in that courthouse basement with dust settling around me, when the weight of the doctor's notes became too heavy to bear. I wanted to stop, to close the trunk, to pretend none of this had anything to do with me. But history doesn't loosen its grip just because we look away, especially not history built underground. So I reached for the next bundle, smaller than the others, wrapped not in paper but in a piece of old linen cloth. When I unfolded it, a thin stack of pages slid out. These weren't charts, not medical notes, not blueprints. These were lists, rows of names, female names, some beautifully written, some scrawled as if in haste, some written so faintly they looked like ghosts pressing through the page. I counted them. There were 37 names on the first sheet alone. At the top, in a different handwriting than the master's or the doctor's, was a heading. Women moved to LL 1828 to 1845. Moved. Not assigned. Not housed. Not transferred. Moved. As if this were a location. A station. A destination. A place. I traced the list with my eyes. Eloise. Mathilde. Josette. Claudine. Elin. Celia. Louise. Agnes. Marie D. There she was again. But as I moved down the page, something strange happened near the bottom. The last 7 names weren't written with ink. They were written with charcoal. Dark, grainy, smudged. Every one of those charcoal-written names had something in common. Next to each name, instead of a date or note, there was only one word. Gone. Gone. No details. No explanation. No witness. No record. Just gone. I flipped to the second page. More names. More charcoal marks. More gone. The third page had even fewer details. Most of the ink scratched out as if someone tried to erase the words but the memory wouldn't let them. I counted the word gone 14 times. 14 women. Missing. Erased. Buried somewhere in a history no one wanted written. My throat tightened. Because the ledgers told the story of those who were measured. The doctor's notes told the story of those who were examined. But this list? This was the story of those who never returned. I turned back to the first page and looked closer. Some names had marks beside them. MR equals maternity room. ER equals examination room. HR equals holding room. L equals lower level. S equals sold. But 7 women had no marks. No letters. No traces. Just that word again. Gone. I whispered it into the stillness of the courthouse basement. Gone? The word didn't echo. It sank. Like a confession whispered into dirt. I picked up one page that looked especially worn. The ink looked newer than the others, as if someone had rewritten a list maybe years later, trying to remember every name before memory itself faded. At the bottom of that sheet was a note in a small, careful feminine handwriting. Hold these names. Someone must remember. I recognized the handwriting. I'd seen it before. It was the same handwriting on the message. Tell my daughter I remembered her. This wasn't a list written by the master or the doctor. This was written by the women. Maybe one woman. Probably several. Maybe my great-grandmother. Women who had been forced underground, but refused to let their sisters vanish into silence. I felt my chest ache. These weren't just names. They were lives. Stories. Lost. Songs never recorded. Dreams never allowed to grow. Children never held long enough. Hands that worked, stitched, prayed, clung, trembled. Women who endured the basement. And women who didn't come back. Women the world never asked about. Women the records didn't care about. Women this list refused to forget. I whispered the first 3 names out loud. Eloise. Mathilde. Josette. No answer. Just dust floating through the light. But speaking their names felt like opening a window in a sealed room. Then I found the page that tied everything together. A small note, written vertically down the margin, almost hidden. Some taken to the river. Some buried between the pines. Some we never saw again. I closed my eyes. The river. The woods. The pines. This was Louisiana. Bodies could disappear anywhere. No law. No record. No witness. And no one asked questions, because who in power would have cared about an enslaved woman gone missing? The plantation needed workers, not truth. The country needed cotton, not justice. And the basement needed silence, not survivors. The last name on the final page made my heart jump. Claudette, gone. Claudette. Elin mentioned her. My great-grandmother wrote her name in her secret message. A woman who had guided others, whispered wisdom, held people together in darkness. Gone. No story. No burial. No headstone. Just a charcoal mark and the truth the world tried to bury. I held the list against my chest. It felt like holding bones. I knew then that this wasn't just history. It wasn't just a project. It wasn't just a discovery. This was a graveyard built out of paper. And somehow this list, this fragile, smudged, grief-filled list, had survived where the women had not. Because someone, maybe my great-grandmother, refused to let the world forget. Names erased. Lives vanished. A list becomes the only grave marker for women who were never meant to be remembered. If these names belonged to your ancestors, how would you honor them? The lists of missing women were devastating. But the next discovery, the one tucked between two brittle ledgers, was the first glimpse of something else. Not horror. Not tragedy. Resistance. It came in the form of a fabric square folded so many times the creases looked permanent. Thin, worn, brown from age. Like it had once been part of a mattress, a dress, or maybe a baby's blanket. Inside it were notes. Dozens of tiny scraps. Some torn corners of ledger paper. Some slivers taken from seed sacks. Some written with ink. Some with charcoal. And some marked with punctures. Tiny dots made by a sewing needle. A code. A secret language. A way to speak when voices weren't allowed. The first scrap I opened was only a few words written in shaky French. Hold breath. Footsteps. A warning. Passed from woman to woman inside the basement. The next one said, hide the cloth. He counts everything. Probably the overseer. Maybe the doctor. Maybe both. Then I found a scrap that felt like a heartbeat pressed into paper. Sing only during cleaning. They think it distracts us. Sing? During cleaning? I didn't understand until I read the next line. Humming covers our whispers. My breath hitched. The women used chores. Chores forced on them. As camouflage. While sweeping, while folding garments, while boiling water. They hummed. Just loud enough to sound harmless. Just soft enough to hide the sound of their own planning. Suddenly the basement felt less like a tomb. And more like a battlefield. Not one with weapons. But one with courage. I sifted deeper into the bundle. Another scrap, larger this time, held a message written in tight, deliberate strokes. If you speak too loudly, the walls speak too. I frowned at that. It felt metaphorical at first, until I read one more note. Voices travel through the air holes. Be careful. The ventilation shafts. The thin iron pipes that led to the kitchen building above. Whispers inside the basement would rise through those shafts. If someone above heard something wrong, a conversation, a name, a plan, punishment would follow. So the women learned how to speak in silence. Their coded stitches confirmed it. One small piece of linen had rows of needle pricks arranged in patterns. Not random. Not mistakes. A message stitched in dots. I recognized the pattern from a book on coded quilts used by enslaved people on the Underground Railroad. Dots and stitches could represent letters. Could represent warnings. It took me a few minutes to decipher the pattern. And when I finally understood it, a chill spread through my whole body. The code read, he is coming. A warning passed quietly between women who had no way to speak. The next fragment was different. Bigger, thicker, stained with something dark in one corner. Read, Claudette says, keep eyes soft. Keep voice low. Keep mind somewhere he cannot go. Claudette again. The name that kept appearing. The woman other survivors remembered. The woman marked gone on the lost list. I felt like I knew her now. A leader in the shadows. A light in the dark. A quiet architect of survival. Another note beneath hers said, when you are afraid, breathe steady. They watch breath more than eyes. I didn't fully understand until I read the next. Fear makes the chest rise fast. Breathe slow so they think you accept. Acceptance was survival. Pretending calm meant protection. They were learning the science of appearing compliant, so they could think freely behind their eyes. These weren't just women enduring horror. They were strategists, warriors, quiet rebels fighting an enemy who controlled their food, their bodies, their babies, their time, their futures. Yet somehow, not their minds, Then I found a note written in handwriting so elegant it felt wrong to see it inside these grim pages. We must remember each other's children. Say their names when the lights go out. Below it, different handwriting added. So they live somewhere, even if only in memory. This hit me hardest. The basement wasn't only a place of suffering. It was a place where mothers were losing their children. Some babies taken within hours. Some within days. Some within months. This note was their answer. Memory as rebellion. Whispering names into darkness. So no child was erased completely. Their resistance wasn't violent. It wasn't grand. It was human. A soft, stubborn defiance. A refusal to let the system turn them into numbers. Even the doctor's notes couldn't erase something stronger than ink. A mother whispering her baby's name. As I read on, another message made my heart crack. If we cannot leave, our words can. Words, not bodies. They wrote plans, warnings, memories. They hid them. In mattress stuffing. Inside cracks in limestone walls. Under floorboards. Behind loose bricks. One scrap detailed the hiding process. Fold small. Hide in seam of blanket. So shut. Remove thread only when safe. I pictured a woman sewing this message into a blanket. Her hands trembling. Listening for footsteps above. Racing against time before the door opened. And then another note. If they find this place, burn nothing. Leave for someone. Leave for someone. For who? For me. For descendants. For history. They weren't only surviving. They were documenting. They were historians in the dark. Writing a truth the world wasn't ready for. I pressed the scraps to my chest. The paper felt like skin. Warm. Alive. Still speaking. I realized then. These women didn't just whisper to each other. They whispered to the future. To anyone who might one day open a forgotten trunk and find their hidden words. Words stitched and scraped and smuggled across decades. Words that refused to die. In the basement they whispered. They sewed. They warned. Their resistance lived between the walls. If your only weapon was a whisper, would you still fight? Until this point, everything I found showed survival. Endurance. Quiet defiance. Women holding each other up in the dark, trying to keep their minds alive while their bodies were controlled. But one bundle in the trunk, tied with black thread instead of red, told a different story. Not survival. Revolt. The first page was written in a rushed, uneven hand. It began with the tools. Tools? I flipped the page. The account wasn't written by a doctor or master. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't even a testimony from decades later. This looked like the work of someone inside the basement. A woman who had witnessed everything as it unfolded. Her first sentence after the title read, "We knew we could not escape, but we could make the place tremble." The storyteller didn't sign her name, but the handwriting, it looked like Marie's, my great-grandmother's. My pulse thudded in my ears as I kept reading. She wrote about a woman named Celia, one of the women marked gone on the previous list. Celia had been quiet for months, obedient, unmoving. Her silence made the overseer believe she'd broken. But she hadn't broken. She was waiting, watching, learning the patterns better than the overseer himself. Marie wrote. Celia saw which key he used on the cabinets. She saw where the doctor left his instruments. She knew the moment the lantern was placed too close to the shelf. And one night, when the doctor left the room for a moment, Celia moved. Fast, silent. She smashed the doctor's glass thermometer against the edge of the table. Not enough to create noise. Just enough to break the delicate tip. Then she unscrewed the lid of a chemical jar. A small vial labeled something in Latin. And poured it quietly into the doctor's ink pot. Sabotage. Not loud. Not violent. Invisible. When the doctor returned, he didn't notice. But the ink clotted within minutes. His notes smeared. His pen clogged. His charts ruined. A small thing. But in a system built on documentation. Disrupting the records was like cutting a vein. Marie wrote. It was the first time we saw him angry. The doctor shouted. Called the overseer. Demanded to know who tampered with his materials. The women said nothing. Not one word. The doctor stormed out. And the overseer followed. Leaving the door unlatched for just a moment. Celia noticed. She always noticed. She darted forward and kicked a small wooden wedge under the door, keeping it from closing fully. Not enough to escape, but enough to weaken the door's mechanism. Weakness. Crack. A start. Marie continued. That night something changed. The air felt different. The silence felt dangerous. But the sabotage didn't end with ink. It got bolder. Another scrap in the bundle, written in different handwriting, explained the next step. Helen loosened the screws on the restraints. 2 turns each. Enough to slip out when needed. Restraints that looked secure, but weren't. Another note. Claudette hid the doctor's smallest knife behind a brick near the floor. And another. Eloise switched the labeled jars. Pain relief became disinfectant. Disinfectant became alcohol. Alcohol became dye. The doctor began making mistakes. The overseer began losing patience. Their perfect system was no longer perfect. Marie's narrative went on. They thought the darkness made us weak. They did not know the darkness taught us to see. Then she described the night everything broke. The overseer entered the basement drunk. Too drunk to notice his keys jingling loosely at his belt. When he leaned over Helen, keys dangling inches from her hands, she took them, quiet as a breath. The overseer didn't notice until he reached the door and felt the empty loop at his waist. He spun around just as Helen tossed the keys behind the stove, into a gap so narrow even a child would struggle to reach it. Chaos erupted, but not from fear, from purpose. Marie wrote. He struck Helen. And that was when the room changed. Claudette stepped forward, not shouting, not attacking, just stepping between Helen and the overseer, something no woman had ever dared. The overseer raised his hand again, but before he could strike her, another woman grabbed his wrist, then another, not violently, just firmly, deliberately. 7 women held him at once. He staggered, lost balance, crashed into the table. The lantern fell, glass shattered, flames licked the floorboards. Smoke rose, not enough to burn the place, but enough to create panic. The overseer screamed for help. No one came. Upstairs, the master and doctor assumed the noise was routine. This was their mistake. The women acted fast, not to kill him, but to make sure he couldn't call for help. Marie wrote, we covered his mouth with cloth, not to silence him, but to make him breathe his own fear. They held him until he passed out. Then they dragged him to the corner and bound him with the very straps he once used on them. A reversal, a moment of power, a moment that could have changed everything, but didn't. Not yet. Marie ended the page with, we didn't plan to escape that night. We planned to show them we were not shadows. We could shake the walls. And the walls did shake. The next morning, punishment fell swift and brutal. Not all women survived it. Celia didn't. Her fate was inked coldly in a ledger. F11. Disobedient. Removed from program. Removed. Gone. But her act was the spark. The first crack. The one the system never fully recovered from. One broken thermometer. One stolen key. One night the basement stopped being silent. Would you have taken that risk, knowing the price could be your life? The trunk's next bundle was wrapped not in cloth, but in something thicker. Canvas stiff with age. The moment I touched it, dust puffed out in a cloud, and a faint smell of smoke rose with it. Inside were pages darker than the others. Stained with soot, edges curled as if they'd survived a fire by inches. Across the top page, written in a long, elegant script, were 4 words. When everything fell apart. This wasn't a single testimony. It was a collection. Voices layered together. Women speaking from the last years of Belle Noire. When war was closing in. When the master system was cracking. When the world above ground began to crumble while the world below stayed trapped in its ritual of suffering. I breathed in, bracing myself, and began to read. The first account was dated 1861. Food shorter now. Rations cut. Children crying for milk. Doctor visits less. No medicine left. The handwriting trembled on the last line. The Civil War hadn't reached St. Landry Parish yet, but its shadow had. Shipments stopped. Supplies dwindled. The plantation's money dried up. Men were being drafted. Cotton couldn't be shipped. Slaveholders were panicking. But none of that stopped the basement. It only made it more cruel. Marie, my great-grandmother, wrote, we hear shouting above us. Arguments. Master pacing. His footsteps shake dust from the ceiling. Another woman wrote, they say the Union is coming. If they come soon, maybe they will open the door. Hope. Fragile. Dangerous. Then a third note, more realistic. Do not trust rumors. If soldiers come, they may not look for us. We are under the floor. Under the floor. Hidden in plain sight. Forgotten by design. As months passed, new entries appeared. More frantic, more desperate. Doctor dead. Old age, they say. No replacement. Without the doctor, there were no examinations, but also no treatments, no antiseptic, no herbs, no trained hands. Women gave birth in pain. Babies struggled to survive. One wrote, "Infant died this morning. Too cold. We tried to warm him with cloth, but heat would not stay." Another, "We asked for blankets. No answer." And another, "Someone stole the midwife's tools. We suspect upstairs. Maybe sold them." The cracks in the system weren't caused by rebellion this time. They were caused by neglect, panic, chaos above leaking into the world below. In the spring of 1863, the first real sign of collapse appeared. A scrap in faint pencil read, "Overseer left. Ran away. Said he wouldn't die for someone else's land." A second note confirmed it. "Only 2 guards now. One sick. One cruel." Cruel meant punishments grew worse. Sicker meant oversight grew weaker. Weak oversight meant opportunities. Marie wrote, "We hear cannon fire far away. The war is coming closer." Another woman wrote, "If the army comes, hide the papers. Hide the list. Hide our names. He will burn them." She was right. He would. This bundle, the burned edges, the soot stains, proved it. In 1864, the master began preparing to flee. Women recorded the signs. He sells 2 children every week now. He packs trunks at night. We hear wagons. He burned something yesterday. The smoke came through the vents. Smoke. The doctor's vault. The ledgers. The charts. Evidence. He was erasing everything. The system he built over decades. But he didn't get all of it. He never searched the basement mattresses. He never checked between the stones. He never knew women had hidden the truth in the seams of blankets, in cracks behind shelves, in pockets of clothing washed by hand in the dim candlelight. History always tries to survive, even in darkness, even in whispers. One entry, dated only months before emancipation, felt like a final breath. "If anyone finds this, know we tried to save our children. We tried to save each other. Then, if we do not leave this place alive, let our stories leave." I sat against the courthouse wall and let those words wash over me. All this time, I had been reading from a trunk sealed by a clerk in 1893. But the words inside? They had been written by women who knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't only documenting suffering. They were documenting truth. A truth they knew might not be believed, might not be wanted, might not be safe. But they wrote it anyway. Because even if no one came to save them, they could save their stories. The last account in the bundle was from August 1865, after Union soldiers finally reached the plantation. Written in shaky letters. They opened the door. The light burned our eyes. We did not know it was morning. We did not know days anymore. The second line. Some women fell when they tried to walk up the stairs. A third. Children hid behind us. They thought the soldiers were new masters. The war ended the basement. But not the trauma. Not the grief. Not the lives lost underground. Marie's last entry from this period simply said, "We are free. But we do not know how to feel it yet." I closed the bundle and wiped my eyes. Freedom had come too late for many. But not too late for their stories. Stories they fought to record. Stories buried under ash, locked in metal, hidden by fear. Stories waiting for someone. A descendant, a stranger, a seeker. To bring them into the light. War brought chaos. Chaos brought collapse. The basement fell, but only after lives had already been carved into its walls. If you opened the door to that basement in 1865, what would you have said to the women waiting in the dark? By the time I reached the last bundle in the trunk, the courthouse lights had dimmed to their evening glow. The room felt colder, quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. This bundle wasn't paper. It wasn't maps or ledgers or testimony. It was soil. A small linen pouch tied with string, its bottom stained the color of deep earth. A label dangled from it, ink faded but still legible. From the lower foundation. Recovered 1893. I opened the pouch slowly. Inside was dirt, dark, heavy, and mixed with something I didn't recognize. It felt wrong to touch it, as though the ground had absorbed too much sorrow to be ordinary. Then I found what the soil had been hiding. A scrap of mortar, cracked in half, with a single word scratched into it. Below. Below. Not basement. Not cellar. Not underground chamber. Just below. A place beneath a place. A secret beneath a secret. The word alone made my skin prickle. I thought I had learned everything. The breeding charts. The coded notes. The sabotage. The final days of collapse. But this scrap, this piece of stone, was telling me the one thing none of the documents had said outright. The basement was bigger than anyone had recorded. Someone had scratched that message into the stone long before the building collapsed. Someone who had been deeper than the doctor's rooms, deeper than the nursery, deeper than the known chambers. Someone who wanted the world to know. There was more. The next folder contained something I didn't expect. A set of maps. Drawn in pencil, shaky and imprecise, but maps nonetheless. 3 drawings on stiff paper, each labeled LL1, LL2, LL3, lower level 1, lower level 2, lower level 3. I stared at the pages, numb. The breeding program had multiple floors. The women weren't just kept in the basement. They were kept under the basement. The first map, LL1, showed rooms I recognized from earlier descriptions. The medical chamber, the delivery room, the sewing room, the nursery. LL2 was smaller. 4 rooms. Each labeled only with a single letter. B. But LL3 was almost entirely blank. Just a narrow corridor drawn in shaky graphite. At the end of the corridor, a simple marking. Cross mark. No name. No description. No explanation. Just a red X drawn decades later in crayon by whoever cataloged the map in the courthouse. And beneath that mark was one more note in tiny handwriting. Not safe. My mouth went dry. The basement wasn't just a place of birthing and examinations. It was an entire system, vertical, hidden, layered in secrecy deeper than the records ever admitted. And the lowest level was a place even the women didn't dare describe. The next account, written long after the war by someone who had returned to the ruins, explained the significance of these drawings. Read. When the house was torn down, we found the top stair. Nothing else. The rest was filled in. Filled in. Not collapsed naturally. Filled deliberately. Someone, most likely the master's family, had ordered soil and debris to be poured into the opening. To seal the rooms. To hide the truth. To bury everything that had happened. Another note. We heard there was a 3rd level. But it was sealed before we arrived. A 3rd level. The one marked with an X. What happened down there? Punishment? Isolation? Experimentation? Disposal? The documents didn't say. And that absence was louder than any description could have been. The final handwritten testimony in the bundle came from a man, an overseer's apprentice, who later confessed to a priest in 1874. His writing was weak, as if he was shaking. They made me help cover the door. We carried soil for 3 days. They said it was a danger. They said no one must go inside. Then a second paragraph. On the last night I heard tapping from below. 3 knocks. Then 2. Then 1. My heart froze. I reread the line. 3 knocks. 2. 1. Not random. A pattern. A signal. The overseer's apprentice wrote. I asked if we should open it. He said no. He said they were supposed to be gone already. The next line was barely legible. I still hear the knocking in my dreams. I sat completely still, because tapping, patterns of knocks, had been mentioned once before. In the coded notes from Section 7. If it is safe, tap 3 times. The women had used tapping as communication, meaning those knocks from the sealed floor. They weren't ghosts. They were people. People alive. People trapped. People who realized the doorway was being closed. People who knocked because they believed someone above might listen. Someone might help. Someone might dig. But no one did. The master sealed them in. The overseer walked away. And the ground kept their secrets for more than a century. The last page in the bundle, signed only by initials MD, contained a single plea. If you are blood of ours, do not let the world forget. Those left below. Blood of ours. Blood. Marie Deslands. My great-grandmother. She wasn't asking for revenge. She wasn't asking for justice. She wasn't asking for punishment. She was asking for remembrance. To speak their names. To tell the truth. To bring light into a place that had no windows, no candles, no voices left. I folded the map of LL3 with trembling hands. The red X burned into my mind. Not safe. Not empty. Just forgotten. The ground still remembers. And now, so do I. There weren't just rooms beneath the plantation. There were levels, sealed, buried, and still whispering through the soil. If you found a sealed door beneath your ancestors' land, would you open it? When I finally lifted my head from the trunk, the courthouse basement felt different. The air was still. Too still. As if the room itself was holding its breath. I had uncovered maps of levels no one admitted existed. Soil from a place that had been sealed alive. Knocks recorded by a terrified apprentice. But the last documents in the trunk, the ones tucked deepest inside, wrapped in oilskin to protect them from moisture, didn't speak of architecture or suffering. They spoke of stories. Stories the women carried. Stories whispered in the dark. Stories that were so powerful they survived even after the walls collapsed. The first page, written in a steady feminine hand, had the title, "We told these so the dark would not keep us." These weren't fairy tales. They were memory. I began reading. The first story came from a woman named Josette, who had been in the basement for more than a decade. Marie wrote down her words as faithfully as she could. "My mama taught me that souls live in breath. If someone steals your breath through fear, you must breathe slow until you steal it back." Her mother had died before the war, but her lesson lived on. Marie wrote beneath it, "We breathed slowly because of Josette." I could picture them. A circle of women in flickering lamplight, eyes tired, voices trembling, breathing slow not because they were calm, but because calm was rebellion. Another story belonged to Claudette, the leader whose name was marked "Gone" on the list of missing women. A fragment of her words were preserved. "My grandmama always said, if they take your name, speak it into the walls. The walls remember more than men do. The walls remember." The phrase hit me like cold water. Because the soil, the stone, the collapsed chambers, they did remember. They held the voices no one heard. The knocks no one answered. The footsteps of those forced to walk in endless circles to stay alive. The next line from Claudette's story chilled me. "Speak your baby's names twice. Once to God. Once to the stone." A mother trying to ensure her child's existence survived even if she did not. Memory as immortality. The third story was darker. It came from Eloise, one of the women recorded in the missing list. Only one line survived. "When the lights go out, hum low. God walks in humming." To anyone else it might sound metaphorical. But to women trapped underground, humming wasn't comfort. It was code. Resistance. Signal. If humming meant God was walking, it meant they had refused to let silence win. Another page, written in multiple handwritings, held a communal superstition. A belief that spread through the basement. If you sleep with your head toward the stairs, your dreams can climb. Dreams can climb. But bodies couldn't. The line made me set the paper down and breathe. These women weren't just surviving cruelty. They were building their own universe in the dark. A universe where memory mattered. And dreams were allowed to climb even when they themselves were trapped below. One long entry grabbed my attention because its handwriting matched my great-grandmother's exactly. The heading said, "What we told the children. Children. Born underground. Raised underground. Separated before they understood why." Marie had recorded the rule. "Tell no child the whole darkness at once. Give them brightness in pieces." She explained. "We told them stars were above us even if we could not see them. We told them their names were gifts, not chains. We told them the door would open someday. The door did open years later when Union soldiers arrived. But not all the children survived long enough to see daylight." Marie ended her entry with the line, "We gave them hope because we could not give them air." My throat tightened. Hope kept them alive. Hope kept their stories alive. Hope traveled through women who whispered their truths into mattresses, soil, stone. Anywhere that could hold the memory. Another part of the bundle contained something extraordinary. Songs. Fragments of them. Written phonetically, recorded in the rhythms the women used to regulate their steps, their breaths, their work. One song repeated a phrase. "Feet on stone, heart on sky. Feet trapped. Hearts rising." Another said, "We walk the circle but the circle moves." Meaning, they might be trapped in one place, but their story would not stay trapped with them. Even their suffering moved forward, into generations that came after, into me. The last story was unlike the others. It was not hopeful. It was not symbolic. It was a warning. A set of lines written by someone who had been in the lowest level, LL3. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as if the writer had no stable surface to lean on. The message read, "If the ground ever breaks again, do not dig where the breath stopped." The second line beneath it, "The place marked is not empty. The place marked." The red X on the LL3 map. The lowest level. The one labeled "not safe." I felt a shiver crawl up my arms. Someone had written that warning from inside the third level. Inside the sealed place. Inside the floor that the apprentice heard knocking from. This wasn't mythology. This was memory. This was testimony. The land itself had swallowed what they could not escape. I gathered the pages back into the bundle with trembling fingers. These stories weren't just relics. They were echoes. Echoes of women who refused to let darkness steal everything from them. Echoes of children raised by whispers and hope. Echoes of rebels who fought with breath, thread, songs, and memory. Echoes that traveled decades, hiding in cracks and scrap paper, waiting for a descendant to hear them. Waiting for me. In the basement, stories were the only light. They whispered hope, fear, warnings, and truth meant for future generations. If your ancestors whispered to you across a century, would you listen? I stayed in the courthouse basement long after the sun had set outside. The overhead light flickered once, humming quietly as if warning me the building would soon close. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not after what I'd read. Not after the voices I'd met. The trunk in front of me wasn't just wood and metal. It was a doorway. A doorway into a world buried so deeply that even the families who lived through it had tried to forget. And now, somehow, that doorway had opened for me. I ran my hand across the final bundle of documents, feeling the uneven edges, the fragile fibers, the pulse of something that felt alive. Not literally, but spiritually. These were the stories that survived by hiding. Stories carried through whispers. Stories stitched into blankets. Stories pressed into soil. Stories coded into songs. Stories meant for someone. I had always thought history was written by the people in charge. But these pages, these scraps, proved something else. History survives because oppressed people refused to let the truth die. They hid it, protected it, carried it, even when the world tried to erase them. Especially when the world tried to erase them. When I lifted the trunk lid to close it, something slipped from the inner corner. A folded square of paper so small it could have been missed forever. I unfolded it. 4 lines. Written in handwriting I now recognized instantly. My great-grandmother, Marie. Her final message. The one she clearly wrote knowing this trunk might one day reach her bloodline. It said, "If you are reading this, it means we were not lost. It means someone lived. It means memory won." My chest tightened. I had read thousands of words that night. Charts, lists, maps, testimonies, warnings, songs, hopes, myths. But these 4 lines, quiet, steady, full of dignity, felt heavier than all the others, because they weren't written for historians, or lawyers, or priests, or newspapers. They were written for me, for the future, for the bloodline that slaveholders believed would break, for the descendants they never imagined would rise from the floors they built. And in that moment I realized, the people who lived in the basement were not just victims. They were architects of survival. They built memory the way others built walls. They built stories the way others built power. They built legacy the way others built profit. And they left those blueprints in this trunk. I sat back down, breathing slowly, the same slow, controlled breaths Josette had taught the women to use in the dark. And when I did, I heard something strange. Nothing supernatural. Nothing ghostly. Silence. But the silence felt different. Full. As if every page I read had filled the room with spirits who had been waiting for someone to hear them. I imagined them. Eloise, Claudette, Josette, Celia, Helen, Agnes, Marie, and all the names written in charcoal. The names marked gone. The names spoken into stone and soil so their existence wouldn't be erased. For the first time, I understood why this story mattered. Not just for history, not just for justice, but for identity. Because when history is hidden, identity becomes incomplete. And when truth is buried, descendants walk with shadows they don't understand. These women weren't only telling their story, they were telling mine. I closed the trunk slowly, almost reverently, then walked up the courthouse stairs toward the exit. Each step felt heavier, as if I was walking out of their world and back into mine, but carrying all of them with me. When I reached the courthouse doors, the night air hit my face. Warm, still, alive. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of generations standing behind me. Generations who didn't get sunlight, who didn't get choices, who didn't get freedom until the day their bodies were too tired to feel it, who didn't get the chance to say goodbye to their own children. Yet somehow, they still reached me. Through coded stitches, through whispers in the dark, through a trunk no one was supposed to open, through love, through memory, through defiance, through legacy. As I started my car, one thought burned in my mind. I am their proof. I am the evidence they lived. I am the descendant they hoped for, the one who would tell the truth. And truth, once found, doesn't go back into the dark. Not anymore. I drove home with the windows down and the warm Louisiana night moving through the air. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn blew. Low, steady, almost like a hum. A hum. A song of resistance, a reminder. Feet on stone, heart on sky. Their feet were trapped, but their stories were not. Their hearts were not. And now, neither was mine. When I got home, I wrote every name from the trunk onto a clean piece of paper. Not a list, a memorial. And at the bottom I added, "You are not forgotten. Not anymore." Because some stories don't live in textbooks. They live in breath, in blood, in descendants who finally return to the place where silence once ruled, and speak. Truth buried in darkness rose again. Stories meant for the future found their reader. Memory 1. If your ancestors whispered their truth across 150 years, what would you do with it?